This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Jude Southerland Kessler, author of the John Lennon Series. Today, October 9th, Jude Southerland Kessler, the world's leading authority on the life of John Lennon, will release Volume 5 in her John Lennon series. It's titled Shades of Life Part 1. Shades of Life Part 1 follows the Beatles through the first half of 1965, including the making of the Help movie and soundtrack, and their European tour, the Beatles MBE nomination, and the first fissure in the Beatles' unity as Paul records his solo song Yesterday. The year would also see John Lennon publishing his second book of poetry and prose, A Spaniard in the Works, and struggling with staid married life in the stockbroker belt. Kessler's John Lennon series takes readers chronologically through his life. The first 4 volumes, Shoulda Been There, Shivering Inside, She Loves You, and Should Have Known Better. With a personal library of over 500 Beatles-related books and multimedia resources, Kessler undertook 7 trips to Liverpool, England to interview Lennon's childhood friends, early band members, art college mates, and business associates before embarking on writing the series, which is told in a narrative history format and heavily documented. Kessler completed high school in 3 years, and when she was just 17, she went on to Northwestern State University, Louisiana, where she earned 2 degrees, English and History, in 3 years. She immediately won a graduate assistantship to the University of Maryland in 1974 and received her master's degree in English in 1976. She's taught on the junior high and high school levels and was an English instructor at the University of Maryland and Troy State University, Alabama. She also has a paralegal degree in law research. In 1986, she began her research into the John Lennon series. Establishing a reputation as the leading Lennon expert, Kessler began speaking to organizations across the United States, writing for the Kansas City Beatle Fan magazine. She's interviewed U.S. residing Beatles figures such as May Pang, George Harrison's sister Louise, reporter Larry Kane, Angie and Ruth McCartney, and journalist Ivor Davis. She hosts the John Lennon Hour on Beatles-orama Radio and Blog Talk Radio, and she's been featured on BBC's Up All Night, Rod Quinn's ABC Radio Up All Night from Australia, May Pang and Cynthia Nielsen's dinner specials, among other radio and personal appearances. She currently co-hosts the podcast She Said with author Lena Stagg. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Jude, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Eric, for having me here. So close to John's birthday. It is John's birthday today.
It is October the 9th. Amazing. He would be 82 today, wouldn't he?
I know. Can you believe? I mean, really and truly, he, let's see. He would be 81, right?
Oh, 81. Okay.
1940, born in 1940. So, yeah, I just can't even picture John at 81 because he would be, I guess, as hard rocking as Ringo and Paul still are out there in the public eye. But, I think he'd be doing other things. I mean, I can see him exhibiting his art and still very involved in politics and meeting with heads of state. He was so into the political scene towards the end of his life that no telling what he'd be into today.
Now, I could cheat, but I'll just ask you. Now, how old would that make Ringo and Paul? Same age?
Okay, Ringo was born in July of 1940, so he and John were the same age. And in a couple of interviews, Ringo says that John is the oldest, but he's not because Ringo's July and he's October. John is October. But Paul is 2 years younger. And, I mean, you would never know it. When you go to a McCartney concert, we saw him in Bossier City about 2 years ago, and he did almost 3 hours, never took a sip of water, jumped, ran, never sat down, never even put his behind on the stool to play. He was up and going the entire time. That we should all be that lucky.
The Stones were the band that really broke down that barrier of it's okay to keep rocking as long as you can. But Paul and Ringo, you look at those guys and they look so good. Like Ringo doesn't age.
Ringo, I say Ringo has made a pact with the devil.
Yeah.
He looks the same. He looks great.
Yeah. Well, before we get to this amazing series of John Lennon books and the most recent book, I'm curious as to when you became a Beatles fan and when did you become specifically a fan of John?
Well, I was really even before the Ed Sullivan Show, which is unusual because almost everybody else I know hooked into the Beatles in February of 1964. But mine was before Christmas in 1963. One of my friends had gotten either a VJ, I think it was probably a VJ record that had a picture sleeve on it. Could have been Swan. And all of my friends met me when I got off the school bus in the morning at Horseshoe Drive Elementary School. So I'm 9. And they walked up to me with this picture and said, "These are the Beatles. You have to pick one to fall in love with because everybody's in love with one. You've got until recess." What? Recess? Recess is at 10 o'clock. This is 8. I've got until recess to fall in love with someone. And I was I was the kind of kid that worked in the library before school shelving books because that was fun for me, and liked to clean the erasers and made all A's. I was not the rocker kid. I was the studious kid. And so I looked at the picture, and at recess I said, "Okay, I'll pick this guy." It was George. And they all went, "What?" And you could tell I totally disappointed them. So I said, well, can I think about it overnight? So I took the thing home and I called their big sisters and said, "Tell me about these guys. What about these Beatles?" Found out that John had started the band. They didn't know a lot about him because you remember this is pre-Ed Sullivan, but they knew he had started the band, and they said he's the smart Beatle and he's the leader and everything. So I went back the next day and said, "Okay, I'm switching to John." And it's been John ever since. But I knew nothing. I was just going on his personality, what people had said, that he was, quote unquote, the smart Beatle. But of course, once you hear John's life story, everything changes because there is as my father-in-law once said, where are the happy chapters? There are very few happy chapters. And yet he takes all of the bad that happens to him and he channels it into song, sorrow transformed into song, and gave us what for me and for many baby boomers was the soundtrack of our lives through the pain that he experienced. And that's remarkable.
And when did you realize that in order to tell the complete story, it was going to have to go beyond just one book?
I had all intentions at the beginning of writing one book. And I did 20 years of research. And thankfully, I did that when all of these people like Bob Wooler and Alan Williams and June Furlong, they were all still alive. And Liverpool still looked like Liverpool of the Beatles. This is before they were nominated for the world's city of culture about 10 years ago. And when they received that nomination, they remodeled everything. The Grapes was remodeled. All of the places that the Beatles had played were all remodeled. Everything was updated. But when I got to see it, they still had the blue Delft tiles at the Grapes around the fireplace and the same corkscrew, oak corkscrew wooden leg tables that the Beatles used to sit at, and everything looked the same. But I started doing 20 years of research and 7 years going back and forth to Liverpool, interviewing everyone that John had gone to elementary school with and high school with, and talking to his professors and talking to the early Beatles like Len Gary and the doorman at the Cavern Club, and really gathering all of my research. And after 20 years, I started writing book 1, and it became apparent when I reached about 800 pages, and I was only up to the 10th of December, 1961. And I thought that's when Brian offered them that loose managerial agreement. And John said, "Right, manage us then, Brian." I'm like, okay, they've just gotten Brian as their manager and I'm at 800 pages. We haven't even reached Beatlemania yet. So I'm going to have to make this a 3-volume series. And then when I got into book 2, which is 61 through 63, The Rise to Fame Everywhere Except for America, and I'm at 700 pages, I'm like, okay, this is going to have to be a 9-volume series. And sadly, because I wanted it to be number 9, and stick with 9 volumes, I've had to split this book into 2 parts because 1965 is intense. And this book that's coming out is only January 1st, 65 through mid-August, when they get on that plane to take off for the 1965 North American tour. And it's 820 pages. So this book is going to be part 1 and part 2. It's going to end up being 10 volumes.
This series, it is, as you say, it's so extensive. And the first volume, titled Shoulda Been There, that covered the first 20 years of John's life. Can you talk about John's childhood, the story of his mother and father, and the effect that they had on John in later years? Can you get to that for those who are not super familiar with that?
Yes. And that is the person that I wrote this book series for. I mean, John Lennon, the Beatle, absolutely incredibly talented. John Lennon, the peace activist, strong and powerful and influential. John Lennon, the artist, unique. But the little boy, John Lennon, that for whom everybody should have been there and no one ever was, is the person that I'm writing this series about, because the hole that was carved into John's heart by the things that happened in his childhood was not filled until almost the end of his life. He tells you on the White Album, he says, half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia, who is his mother. That's his mission statement. So 4.5 years old, his father's been gone to World War II. And then after World War II, because he's a merchant seaman, he doesn't come home right away. He's on various and sundry ships. His mother, who has been raising him by herself, living first in a dairy cottage that her father furnished for her, and then later is actually, the dairy cottage was actually a connection with her sister's husband, and that she was living there for a while. She lived with her father for a while. She finally goes off on her own. She is, you got to remember, she's really young. She's beautiful. She is a very sexy woman who wears 6-inch heels and tight slacks at a time when women look like Donna Reed in house dresses and pearls. And if a man would whistle at her as she was walking down the sidewalk, instead of being offended, she would say, "You're not so bad yourself." Julia was an artist. She played a banjo in the pubs around Liverpool. She had a gorgeous smile and long red hair. And so she has this little boy that is precocious and very, very smart and difficult to deal with. I'm sure John didn't behave very well. They used to tie him into his high chair and he'd untie it and get down. I mean, he was a really smart and bold kid. So for years, her father, Pop Stanley, had been trying to get Julia to give this child away to her older and more stable sister, Mimi, who was married, who was decorum with a capital D. And finally, one day, Fred Lennon shows up and finds John, not with Julia, not with his wife, but living 2 and 3 weeks at a time with the older sister, Mimi. Little John has found out that when his mother's gone to play in the pubs and go out on dates and do all these things that she's doing while Fred is away, John will get on the bus with the green seats and it will take him to his aunt's house. And he starts hanging out there more and more and more and more. Well, Fred thinks, I want my son. I want this child. So he doesn't ask Julia's permission. He doesn't ask Mimi's permission, the older sister. He takes the boy and leaves and runs away to Blackpool. He gets passage on an ocean liner that's going to take him to Australia, and he's taking the boy. And they're going to live father and son together forever. But he made a mistake in telling his brother, Sidney, who never thought that Fred was responsible, who never thought that he should have John. And Sidney tells Julia where they are. And Julia shows up on their doorstep the night before they're going to leave. Now, the story that John always believed, and the story that John always told, Mark Lewison in the last few years has said is not true, that Billy Hall, who was a friend of John's father's, was in the kitchen and overheard what was going on in the other room, and says that Julia and Fred reached an amenable agreement that she would take John back with her. But what John was told, and what John always said, is that he, the 5-year-old, is placed in the middle of the two of them and is asked to choose. Who do you want, your father or your mother? And he's been with his dad for 3 weeks. His dad's been letting him roll up his pants and wade in the surf at Blackpool and see all of the birds that are flocking around. They've had a great time together. He taught him to whistle through his teeth. And there was how you are when you're with your dad. And he chose his dad. And then he sees his mother turn sobbing and walk out crying. And he runs after her, saying exactly what he says in Mother, later in Daddy Don't Go, Mother Don't Go, Daddy Come Home. He's screaming, Mommy, stop, come back. And she just swoops him up, looks at Fred with this imperious smile, takes him and goes back on the train to Liverpool, where she gets a taxi, goes immediately to Mimi's house. And the little boy says to her, "You're not going to leave me, are you?" And she's like, no, just go play. You promise you're not going to leave me? No. And he runs in the backyard to play with his little dog, Sally. And when he does, she leaves. And she's gone this time for good. She has made an agreement with her father that for John's best interest, she's going to let Mimi raise him. Now, a long interview with Julia Baird, his sister, his half-sister, Julia Baird, about 3 months ago. The transcript is in this new book that's coming out. And she says, my mother's heart was broken. All these authors, including me, and Shoulda Been There. I mean, I paint her as being heartbroken, but I paint her as willingly giving him up because we didn't know any better. Julia didn't know any better. No one knew. But just a few years ago, her aunt, who was dying, called her to come up and meet with her. And Julia went. And her aunt said, I want you to know that your mother was forced to give John away by her father. Mimi had reported her twice to social services because she would go off and leave John. When she went off to play her banjo at night, she wouldn't leave him with the babysitter. She'd just leave him. And the neighbors could hear him crying next door. And she did not have a proper bed for John and a lot of other things. And Mimi had turned her in twice. So the father said, if you don't let Mimi take him, we're going to put him up with social services and he'll go, it's child protective care. It broke Julia's heart. She adored her son and she always wanted him back. But John was never told that. And what he sees is this. His mother goes on to fall in love with John Dykins. Fred won't give her a divorce. She's living with John Dykins and they have 2 children. They have Julia and Jackie. So what he sees is, oh, wait a minute. My mother doesn't hate children. It isn't children that she didn't want. It's me she doesn't want. So for the rest of his life, he is singing from this gigantic hole in his heart. He's singing I'll Cry Instead, which is about, I've got every reason on earth to be, and he alternately would sing mad and sad because I just lost the only girl I had. If I could get my way, I'd give up. But I can't, so I cry instead. I don't want to cry when there's people there. I get shy when they shout and stare. I'm going to hide myself away, and he does. He hides under this protective shell of anger and sardonic humor and sarcasm, and I'm the tough guy in the band. But what you're really looking at is a little boy with a broken heart. He tells you that's who he is in Nowhere Man, and I'm a loser, and I'm not what I appear to be. In health, he even tells you in a song that no one has been able to figure out about the girl who came to stay. She's the kind of girl you want so much it makes you sorry, yet you don't regret a single day. Girl. I mean, he sings to Julia at the microphones of the world for the rest of his life. And at the very end in the White Album, in case you didn't catch on, he tells you that she's the reason that he sings. He tries to, even though she tragically, the story is so heartbreakingly sad because his uncle, George, we haven't really talked about, his name was George Too Good Smith, sweet, kind, loving man. George becomes the only parent that John will ever have. His Aunt Mimi makes him do his homework. She takes him to school. She takes him to Sunday school. She makes him do chores. She is duty, but she is not love. And when he says to her, Aunt Mimi, why are you here every day when I get home from school? She says, because it's my duty to do so. Not what he wants to hear, because I love you. But George teaches the little boy to read from the Liverpool Echo. He reads John's serial stories that he writes. He pretends with John. He sneaks him away to the picture drones, the movies that come to Liverpool. And by the time that John is 14 and a half, they are best friends. And they send John away on holiday to Scotland for 2 weeks because they know that George is dying. And when John comes home, George has passed away and already been buried. They don't even let him be there to say goodbye. And he goes hysterical. He starts laughing and can't stop. I mean, by 8:00 that night, they are afraid that he's lost his mind. And so they send for his mother, send for Julia to come. And she comes in and sits on the bed with him and says, I know I can't replace George. I know there will never be another George, but I am going to become your best friend. I'll be there for you. We will hang out together. We will play rock and roll. You can skip school and come to my house. I'm going to be your best friend. And for 2 glorious years, she is. He skips sometimes 2 weeks in a row. Doesn't tell Mimi. Goes and hangs out with his mother. She teaches him to play the banjo. She lets him drink ginger beer and eat cake. And he's just living the life of the happiest life he's ever lived, and falls for her, like with a ton of bricks, falls for her. So one night she's summoned to Mimi's house for this lecture on you've got to quit letting John skip school, and you've got to make sure he does his work, and you're ruining him, Julia. Mimi, it says, we've got to do better about this. I know what you're doing, and you're ruining him. You're encouraging this rock and roll. He wants to be Mr. Presley, and Mr. Presley, he's not. And I know you gave him money for his first guitar that he ordered, that mail order guitar. Cut it out. And they've had this big meeting of the minds. And at 10:00 at night, Julia leaves. John's at her house over on 1 Blomfield Road. She steps out into the dual carriageway that is Menlove Avenue to go to the bus, does not see a drunk driver speeding towards her, is knocked 40 feet in the air and killed. And now he's lost her a second time to death. I mean, this is a lot to happen to someone in only 17 years. This is a lot. And he just can't handle it. And he is broken and goes into his room at Mimi's house and doesn't come out for 3 weeks. She puts food outside his door. He won't speak. He won't talk. But when he does finally come out, when it's time to go to school and he comes out, he is a different person. He is John that we know on bad days, when you can see that look on his face in a news conference and he's going to slice them up with razored words. And he's hard. He appears to be very callous, but he's anything but that inside.
What's become of where is his dad at this point now? You refer to him as Fred. He's Alfred, yes. But they called him Fred.
Yeah, or some people call him Freddie. Some people called him Alfred. Some people called him Fred.
And where is he at this point now at when John's 17?
Okay, so right after he was rebuked and left, he went on and had a very colorful career on different merchant ships. At one point, he's arrested and thrown in jail for going AWOL from the ship and going into town and gambling and drinking. And he's a party boy and very talented, just like John, a great singer. He was always entertaining people with his music. But he's writing to John. Every week, he's sending him a letter. Mimi intercepts the letters, and John never sees one word from his father. Mimi, after about 6 months, has had enough of it, and she writes to him. She's in port at this point. She writes to him and says, enough. Don't contact him again. We've had a hard enough time stopping the nightmares, because he keeps having nightmares that he's fallen into a deep hole and he can't get out. It's taken us months to calm him down. He's just starting to fit into life here in Mendips. If he hears from you, he's going to be unhappy all over again. If you write to him again, I am going to tell him who you really are, that you've been arrested and that you're a bad influence and that you are a drinker and a gambler and blah, 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 blah. I'm going to make sure that he hates you. So Fred never writes to him again. And he probably would never have contacted John again if a guy at the Tatler, which is kind of like the a rag that would do sensational stories on people, says to him, we figured out who you are. We know you're John Lennon's father, and we're going to blast it all over our news magazine. And so Fred wants to get to John before this story comes out. So he calls Brian Epstein in 1964 and says, can I come to your office and meet with John? It'll only be a few minutes, but I want him to know the true story before they tell this fake story. He does. And people have said it was a bad meeting, that, John didn't like him. That's not true. It was a 20-minute meeting. We have both what John said that they said and what Fred said that they said to each other, and they line up pretty accurately. After the meeting, if you know anything about John Lennon, you know that John can't recover when he's angry. If he's angry, he can't act like he's in a good mood. He is hostile. He's smart aleck. He sneers at people. When he's in a bad mood, you know it. He has an interview immediately after the meeting with Fred, and he's smiling and he's laughing and he's telling jokes. We know that it was a good meeting. And after that, John started sending Fred a very small stipend once a month. Not anything big, very small. Fred doesn't ask for anything from him until 1 year later, when he shows up at the door of Kenwood, introduces himself to Cynthia and says, all I want is to meet my grandson. I'll leave. I won't even be here when John comes home, but I would just like to meet my grandson. And she invites him in and then invites him to stay for 3 days. And of course, John goes crazy when he comes home and finds out that she's invited him to stay for 3 days, because he's not capable of handling the emotions that are involved in. He's still mad at his father. I mean, even though he knows by now that his father was told not to contact him, he's still angry, that he was left all those years. And for 3 days, the two of them struggle with each other. And finally, John tells him to get out. Now, they do reconcile many times after that. They meet many times after that. It's always the same, Eric. It starts off well. John seems to be handling it, and then he can't handle it, and he ends up fighting with his dad. But towards the end of Fred's life, they do reconcile, and John understands in his mind what happened, but in his heart, he has a choice. Either I'm mad at my father for leaving me, or I'm mad at my mother for leaving me, and he can't be mad at her. He is so in love with her that he can't be mad at her. So the scapegoat has got to be his dad, and he is. And Bill Harry says that Fred is the most maligned character in the Beatles story. He was really a good guy. Really, he was.
He looked a lot like his dad. At least the picture that they have on Wikipedia, the main picture they have in there, it's like if John slicked his hair back.
Yeah.
He looked just like his dad. Now,
and he didn't want you to see that he had that forehead that Fred had. And a photographer took a picture of John in Miami in 1964 water skiing, and the wind was blowing his hair back. He never got to take a picture of the Beatles again. John was so furious. He didn't want you to see that.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. So he never found out about his mother actually wanting him back.
Never knew it, and that would have changed everything. It would have changed. We would probably not be here today. We wouldn't be talking to each other, because had John known that she loved him and wanted him, so many of the songs that he wrote, like Not a Second Time, You Hurt Me Then, You're Back Again. Oh, no, not a second time. Not so many of the songs that he wrote would never have been written. The pain would not have been in his heart. This need to get famous, to get bigger than Elvis, to show her that he's worthy of her love, and that he's smart and he's successful, and that you should have been there for me. None of it would have happened.
Wow.
And the story that Mimi always, before John started writing original songs for Julia, one of the songs that he covered most in the Cavern Club was Baby It's You. It doesn't matter what they say. I'm going to love you any old way. And it's true. I mean, he loves her so much and wants her so much. And then it's compounded in his teen years by the fact that he's never lived with her. He's never seen her as a mother figure. And she is very seductive. All of his friends have crushes on her, and so does John. And she's flirtatious and she has the boys over and he is so entangled with her that when he does meet Yoko, and Yoko is also bohemian and an artist and older than he is, he says in that song to Julia, Ocean Child. Ocean Child is the word Yoko in Japanese. The two of them become intertwined, and he calls Yoko mother. It is a very complex love affair that he has for both Yoko and Julia. And I think Yoko was very aware of the fact that Julia has very oriental eyes. She has the long hair. It's a very complex, intertwined love story.
Mm. Well, that second volume titled Shivering Inside, that covers the magical years, 1961 to 1963. Drummer Pete Best, in and out of the band during this period. He was there with the band while they played in Hamburg, Germany, and some shows in England. He was popular with the fans, especially the female fans, but John, Paul, and George felt he wasn't the guy when it came to future studio recordings?
Well, that
supposedly.
Yeah, that too, it's a very complex story, again, because Pete was preferred by the girls. And at one point, Bob Wooler, the DJ at the Cavern Club, made a suggestion that because Pete was so popular, they would push the drum podium to the front of the stage and they would put the Beatles behind Pete. And oh my gosh, Paul was livid about it. One night, they all go to Manchester for a talent contest. And the girls rip John, Paul, and George out of the photos that they're handing out. They're handing out black and white photos of the Beatles. They rip them out and they pin Pete's picture to their jumpers, their sweaters. And when they get on the bus to go back home, the minibus, Paul's father has accompanied them as a chaperone that night. And he corners Pete and says, "How dare you try to promote yourself over the other boys?" And Pete's like, "I didn't do that. The girls did that. I had nothing to do with it." But he is good looking and he's kind of quiet because Pete's shy. And he's kind of has that sullen James Dean sort of look on his face, rebel without a cause. And his popularity is immense. And there was some jealousy there. John and Pete were extremely close. They roomed together in Hamburg and they go out and do a lot of things together. Had it not been for John's friendship with Pete, he would have been gone eons before, because George was close friends with Ringo. And George wanted Ringo in the band from day one and convinces Paul, who wants Ringo in the band. Only when John's girlfriend, Cynthia, becomes pregnant and he is getting married to her very, very quickly and he's too busy to stop what's going on, Paul and George push the "we want Ringo" scenario. And John is like, fine, do whatever you want to do. And that's when they decide that they're going to let Pete go and bring Ringo in.
That stung Pete Best for many, many years. Took him a while to get past that. He's still, I have a friend who went to see him perform, I guess within the last handful of years. Very nice guy, but that had to have been rough. Yeah.
And the thing is,
he didn't do anything wrong.
No, he did not. I had a podcast years ago on Beatles-orama radio called the John Lennon Hour. And I had Pete on and we would play Pete drumming on Love Me Do and Ringo drumming on Love Me Do. We would play Pete drumming on all of the songs they played at the Cavern Club and then Ringo. And they're both good drummers. They're different. They have a different style, but they're both good. Pete wasn't a bad drummer. That is not true. He just, the deal is Pete lived in West Derby, or West Derby, as they say in Liverpool. It's a city out on the remote edges of Liverpool that's very mom and pop and bicycles and jump rope and sweater sets. It's almost like Hoylake across the river where Cynthia came from, across the Mersey River. It's a very happy family community. So Pete did not have that razor wit that the other Beatles have. And I think that annoyed them, and the popularity annoyed them. He just wasn't like them, although he was a great drummer. And I don't want to tell people that it was because of his drumming, because it was not.
There's the other one, though. Jimmy Nichol was another interesting story. What year was that? You cover that in your books, don't you, right?
That was in the book that covers 1964, which is the last book. Should have known better.
He filled in because Ringo had the tooth.
He had tonsillitis.
Tonsillitis.
On the 3rd of June, they're doing a photo shoot, and Ringo faints dead away onto the floor. He didn't tell anyone he had 103 fever. He had severe tonsillitis. And they put him in the hospital, and they wanted to remove his tonsils then, but the Beatles were leaving in just a matter of days for a world tour. They were going to Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden. They were going on a world tour, and Ringo didn't want to miss. So he goes into hospital. They give him antibiotics. 13 days later, he's able to rejoin the band. But I mean, today, if that happened, the band wouldn't go on tour, right? They'd postpone it. They'd cancel. But you didn't do that in 1964. So Brian had to find someone, Brian Epstein, their manager, had to find someone that could wear Ringo's suit because they didn't have other clothes and could play all of the drum parts. And Jimmy Nichol had just recorded a Beatles cover album in which they did all of the Beatles songs. And he knew the drum part on everything that they were going to play. He was just Ringo's size. And for 13 days, he is Ringo, and it ruins his life. How do you go from in Adelaide 200,000 people screaming for you? And they were fine with Jimmy. They accepted him. They embraced him. How do you go from that to go back to being not known?
He tried launching his own music career after that. And
he did. And was really, there is a fantastic book by one of my very favorite Beatles authors, Jim Birkenstadt. And it's being made into a movie right now. It's going to be out soon about Jimmy Nichol. I think it's Roy Orbison's son that is doing it. I believe that's right. But Jim tells the story so beautifully. There is a picture of Jimmy Nichol sitting in the airport waiting to be shipped back to the UK all by himself with his Beatle gear still on. He's just sitting there dejected with his head down. And, you know, one day he's in and they're laughing with him and they're joking with him and he's part of the camaraderie. And the next day Ringo shows up and nobody really wants anything to do with him anymore because after all, they love Ringo. He's their brother and they brought him in to their hearts and they barely speak to Jimmy after that. And the rejection was just immense.
Was there a mystery behind whether he was alive or not? Do we know that he's definitely since passed?
Well, I won't tell or Jim would murder me because you have to read the end of the book.
Okay.
But it's called The Beatle Who Vanished. And it is just, it's just a great story about the rest of his life and what happened to him. And he may still be alive. That's all I'll say.
All right. Teaser. Now that perfect segue into Stu Sutcliffe. Let's talk about that tour of Hamburg. Really interesting to look back on because here you have a 5-man lineup. John, Paul, George, Stu Sutcliffe on bass, Pete Best. This is when they're developing their musical skills, and it's also when they capture the attention of Brian Epstein or Epstein. You're saying Epstein, so you're the expert. I'm going with Epstein.
Well, he was Epstein to begin with. That is what they said in Liverpool. But when he got ready to go to America in February of 1964, he found out that in America, most people said Epstein. And it had a meeting. I have the transcript of the meeting with Bob Wooler. And he said to him, I'm going to switch it to Epstein because I want to be accepted in America. I want people to, not think I'm strange or different or whatever. And so I'm switching to Epstein. So that's when he changed it over to Brian Epstein. But Stu Sutcliffe, he is one of my favorite people in the Beatles story. So John has lost his mother and father at age 4.5. Then he loses Uncle George at 14.5. And then he loses his mother again. He is floundering. He tells you, I was never sober again another day after my mother passed. He's drinking heavily. He is unable to deal with the grief. And one day he goes into Ye Crack pub in Rice Street, right next to the art college where John is going to school. Bill Harry is sitting there with this guy, the strangest looking guy that John has ever seen because he had his hair cut like mine. It was kind of an elfin pixie cut. He had this big sweater around the scarf around his neck, and he had this long draped coat. And he was sort of looked like a mix between a European artist and one of the Teddy Boys, because the Teddy Boys wore those long drapey coats. And he had on pointed shoes and very different. And Bill says, I want you two to meet because I think you'll be best friends. And he's introducing John and Stu Sutcliffe. Stu was a genius. He finished high school 2 years early and went directly into art college. He was doing artwork that probably would have ranked him with anyone in the 1960s. He did at first gorgeous portraits of people, but then he became very edgy with the splotchy, bold, impressionistic sort of painting. And he got a scholarship to go to Liverpool College of Art. He is genius. But John, who becomes dear friends with him almost immediately, wants him in the band. Stu says, I don't want to be in the band. I don't want to play guitar. It will wreck my fingers and I'm an artist. I can't do that. John will not take no for an answer. He wants Stu with him everywhere he goes. So when Stu wins the John Moore's art competition, which is held every year in Liverpool, he wins a little bit over what would be $100 today. Well, in the 1960s, that's a lot of money. And John says, come on, come with me. We're going to spend the money. And Stu's like, no. I can't spend the money. I've got to buy oils and I've got to buy canvases and I'm burning chairs for heat. I'm so starving that I'm burning furniture for heat. I need this money. And John's like, no, you're not. And he makes him buy a bass guitar, and Stu becomes the first bass player in the Beatles. And legend says that he's horrible, that he has to turn and face away from the audience so people won't see how bad he is. Bill Harry, who was there, has said he wasn't bad. He wasn't great, but he wasn't bad. He was competent. But the problem was, again, second time around, you've got a good looking guy. Stu Sutcliffe was good looking, and he wore sunglasses and he had the aura about him. And again, girls swooned all over Stu. So, he's not long for this world because Paul really does not like him. And there are a lot in Hamburg. When they go to Hamburg, number one, Stu did not want to go because he didn't want to leave his work at Liverpool College of Art. They're going to miss 3 months of school, and he's a serious art student. He does not want to go, but he goes because John wants him to go. They play the clubs, which makes them the Beatles, because they play 6 hours a night, and when they get there, they don't know any songs. They know 20 songs. By the time that they leave, they know 200.
If he's playing bass, what is Paul playing?
Paul is playing rhythm with John.
Oh, rhythm guitar. Okay.
Yeah. They're both playing rhythm. And Paul never wanted to play bass. Never. He only does it when finally, after Hamburg, Stu falls in love with a girl in Hamburg named Astrid Kircher, the photographer who takes those gorgeous black and white pictures of them when they're in Hamburg. The one on the army tank and at the fairgrounds and in a truck, these beautiful, and up in an attic. She takes wonderful portraits of them, but she and Stu fall in love with each other. He asks her to marry him. He stays behind in Hamburg, and he's taken on by one of the most famous artists in the world to learn painting, and he stays. But he comes home to Liverpool in February and joins up with the band again, and they play several gigs. And Paul just really does not like Stu. He does not. And they end up in a fist fight at a couple of points. And so Stu says, that's it. I'm gone. I'm out of the band. And that's when Paul is forced into becoming the bass player. But Stu, in the process of playing with the group, one night, and various authors will tell you various places. Some people say it happened at Litherland. Some people say it happened at Latham Hall. Stu goes out after a gig in which the girls were swarming the stage and just screaming for this band that had come back from Hamburg and were hot and knew all these songs and wore leather and were just rocking the stage. And when he goes out, there's a group of toughs that are waiting for him. And, you stay away from our girls. I don't know who you think you are. And they beat him up. They're kicking him in the head with their boots when John comes out into the alley. And he goes insane and attacks them. He broke his little finger. And in many photos, you can see that John's finger never healed right. He didn't go get it set. It sticks out at a weird angle. And then Pete and Paul come out, and they all fight these guys. But by the time they get Stu into the van, He's bleeding from the nose. He's bleeding from the ears. He will not let them take him to a hospital because obviously his mother doesn't have the insurance to cover it. He doesn't want her to have the bills. So he just goes home and cleans up and doesn't ever tell her what happened. And while he goes back from when he comes to visit in Liverpool in February, he goes back to Hamburg to be with Astrid and to finish his art studies. And he has a cerebral hemorrhage. And within a year, the hemorrhage explodes and he dies. And John once again is devastated because Stu was his world. He was his soulmate, and they were closer than brothers. And so once again, he's just devastated by death.
Man, one of the many things your books on John have garnered praise for is getting the record straight on events. A lot of people thought that was because John kicked Stu in the head.
Yeah.
That story got out there.
That story, when someone originally spread that rumor, Pauline Sutcliffe, who is Stu's sister, said that never happened. They were soulmates. They were best friends. They loved each other. I mean, they fought, but they were friends. They were best friends. And then several years later, and I have her quote saying it never happened. Several years later, someone came to her and offered her a great sum of money to tell that story in a magazine. And so she took the money and said it was true. But Bill Harry, who happened to be there that night, says it absolutely is not true. Other witnesses who were there that night said this incident happened at Latham Hall. It happened after a gig, and John rescued Stu. He certainly never would have kicked Stu in the head. That is, John did some bad things. I mean, I'm not going to say John never did anything wrong. The rumors about him slapping Cynthia, he did hit her twice. And it's not a pretty story, and he did other things that were bad. I mean, he had multiple affairs on her. That's true. But he did not kick Stu in the head. I mean, I tried to tell exactly what happened. But the stories have been so exaggerated in the years that followed. And case in point, Paul's 21st birthday, John had come back from a 12-day trip with Brian Epstein to the Spanish Gold Coast. And Brian, as I think most everyone knows, was gay. And when he came home, everybody teased John about, what went on the trip? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And he didn't really realize that they were going to just unmercifully tease him about it. So at the end of June, this has gone on for almost 2 months now. Bob Wooler says to John, and Bob is the DJ at the Cavern Club, and I don't know exactly what Bob said, and I begged him to tell me, and he said, I'll never repeat those words again. I'm taking them to my grave. But he said something to the effect of, how was the Spanish honeymoon? And John beat him up. But as the years went along, it wasn't just that he beat him up. It was that he picked up a shovel and hit him. I mean, come on. Everybody wants to exaggerate everything. Just tell the truth.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Well, you mentioned Cynthia. Let's talk more about her. It was during this time John married Cynthia, and they had Julian Lennon together. John met her at the Liverpool College of Art in a lettering class in 1957. What was their relationship like in those early years? You already alluded to there were some incidents where he hit her. He was possessive, a little jealous of anybody giving her attention.
Yeah, and he's broken. He's broken. John doesn't think anybody's going to ever love him and be faithful to him. If I fell in love with you, would you promise to be true? I mean, he is always saying to her, you're not going to leave me, are you? You're not going to break up with me, are you? And, you go to Yoko. Fast forward years later. Don't let me down. Don't let me down. I'm in love, but don't break my heart. Don't let me down. You're not going to leave me. Yoko says he asks her all the time, you're not going to desert me, are you? That little boy that got deserted at 4.5 years old by a woman who went on to have other children, so she just didn't want him, never thinks that the girl is going to want him. And he is jealous. If Cynthia as much as spoke to Stu Sutcliffe, his friend, he was jealous. Pete Shotton, one of his big buddies from childhood, if she spoke to Pete, he was jealous. He slapped Cynthia twice, once for what he thought was flirting with Stu, and another time when he thought she was flirting with someone else. And she broke up with him and wouldn't have anything to do with him for weeks. And he would always say what he says in his songs. I'm sorry. He apologizes in his songs more than anything. I'll be a good boy. I'm not going to do it anymore. But John struggled with anything that was emotional. Then he gets to be a Beatle, and you're a young guy. You're, 1964. He's young. He's just getting ready to turn 24 years old. And girls all over the world want him. I mean, they're writing to him and saying, leave your wife and run away with me, and sending pictures, and, he has the world at his feet. So yeah, he was not always faithful to Cynthia, but he called Cynthia every single night of the 1964 North American tour. In early 64, when they went to America for that 3 weeks in which they did the Ed Sullivan Show in Carnegie Hall, John is told by Brian Epstein that he cannot bring Cynthia with him. And he says, I'm bringing my wife with me. She's coming along. And he does. He has one day when they are in France in January of 1964. He has one day off. They're playing 2 gigs a day. And what does he do with his one day off? He gets on a plane and he flies back to London to spend the night with his wife. He adores Cynthia. He loves Cynthia. This myth that he never cared about her, they were together for 10 years. I mean, it was at the beginning a love affair, very much. They were very much in love. But in late March, early April of 1965, and it's in this book, they're invited to the home of their dentist, who is the dentist to the stars, John Riley. And after dinner, Riley and his girlfriend, later his wife, bring them into the parlor. It's George and Patty, George Harrison and Patty Boyd. It's John and Cynthia. And they want to leave because they promised Patty, Klaus, and Gibson that they're going to come hear them perform on their debut at the Pickwick Club. And they want to leave. But the dentist and his girlfriend say, no. You have to at least stay for coffee. Just stay for coffee. And there's 6 sugar cubes lined up on the mantle, which they ceremoniously drop into the cups of coffee, which they thought was very strange. They drink it. And after they drink it, John Riley, the dentist, informs them that he's given them LSD. Didn't ask, didn't get their permission. I'm really surprised John didn't hit the guy. Really surprised. He's furious. He chews him out. How dare you? What do you think you're doing? And they leave. And the dentist is begging them, you can't leave. You can't drive. You've had LSD. And I mean, almost by the time they get in the car is closing in on them. And Riley is following them in his car. And they think he's the devil. And they're scared. And it's the strangest night.
Yeah, that's probably the standout story of this book, and he's probably thinking lawsuits if they're in that car and they die.
If they get killed. I mean, Cynthia has a horrible trip. She tries all night to throw up because she's trying to get out of her system, but she can't. It's horrible. She hates it. She's scared. She's terrified. Patty Boyd wants to smash windows along the street where the Pickwick and Ad Lib clubs are. They have to restrain her. George and John, however, have wonderful experiences. And it's the first time that John has been freed of that sorrow that he has inside of him. Not only that, but he imagines that he's captaining a submarine that all the others are on, and he's navigating them safely. And he sees all these worlds that open up to him. And he realizes that his only escape from the pain that haunts him is drugs. And so after that night, he begins to take drugs all the time. He begs Cynthia to try another LSD trip. And she says to him, I can't. I'm a mother. I have a little baby to take care of. And she does it one more time. And the second trip is just as bad as the first. And she will not go down that road. And that's where 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. She can't go down the road that he's going. And it is ultimately what splits them up. So, but before then, she was a very subdued, conservative young girl. When she meets John and he says that he loves Bridget Bardot, she dyes her hair blonde. She begins to wear mini skirts and fishnet stockings. Every time I hear that song, Don't Make Me Over, I think about Cynthia, because she is made over and she becomes a girl of his dreams. And she supports him. Larry Kane describes Cynthia as John's innermost peace. She is the one that makes him feel confident. She's the one that tells him to go after fame. The day that they're married, he has a gig that night and he asks her to come along and she says, I'm not coming along. You need to go and be there for your fans. And she doesn't. She doesn't intrude on his fame. She just supports him. She was a great wife to John.
But at the same time, she did want the traditional marriage. That was something that John had difficulty, understandably. How was he able to maintain that? You did talk about, there was an excerpt from her book that you put in there. I think it's from 1980, A Twist of Lennon, that she...
Yes.
And she says, when John wasn't working, he lay on the sofa, apparently watching the TV, which he liked to keep permanently switched on, but often a million miles away, lost in a daydream. I talked to him, but he wouldn't hear me. This was nothing new. He'd always been able to tune out of his surroundings, and the busier his life became, the more often he was present but absent. You can imagine how crazy you think. Which I also wanted to ask you about those early years when the Beatles start to take off, Beatlemania takes off. I wonder if any of those guys, not just John, were able to take a step back and appreciate what it was that they accomplished because they were just so damn busy. Another excerpt from your book was Brian Epstein talking about, don't forget, we got a flight to Barcelona bright and early tomorrow morning. And then Saturday, we got a gig in Lancashire. And it's just like every day there's something. Even if he had time off, I don't even know if it was even enough time for him to unwind.
And even when they did have time off, for example, in May, I think, May of 64, they go to Ireland to get away for a few days. It's George and Patty and John and Cynthia. They traveled a lot together. They're there less than 24 hours before the press finds that they're there. And they are in the middle of nowhere at a hotel castle. And they surround the place. And so John calls Brian and says, what are we going to do? And Brian says, you're smart, John. You'll think of something. You can outsmart them. So they go out and they play a game of croquet on the lawn. And as they're playing croquet, they start fighting each other with the croquet mallets. And then they run into the hotel and come out with swords. And they're fighting each other with the swords. And they run back in again. But this time, they have it planned. There's a chauffeur waiting for them. They jump into a car. They all get down and hide. And the car inconspicuously rolls away. And everybody's waiting for George and John to come back out with more swords or with lances or with something exciting to finish the game. And they never come back out. They get away. Everywhere they went, they were surrounded. And I used to read, when my parents were alive, I would read a chapter a day to my parents because my father was blind. And so I would read to them on the phone and read a chapter a day. And one day my mother said, those poor boys, fame wasn't what they thought it was going to be. It's nothing but hard work. And that is the honest truth. They would get up, let's say when they were making a Hard Day's Night and then later help for United Artists. John lived 27 miles from London, but with the traffic going into London, it was an hour drive. He would get up and have some tea and get dressed and get into the car around 6. He would get up usually around 5 because he would have to drive into London for hair and makeup at 7 o'clock. 8 a.m. they're on the set. They work until 5:30, 6 o'clock. At lunchtime, when everybody else takes a break, they do interviews, they do radio shows. Sometimes they go to a luncheon and accept awards, and then they work all afternoon. Then when they get off, they immediately go to tape shows like Ready, Steady, Go or Top of the Pops. They do that until 10 o'clock at night. At 10, all the other Beatles go home. John takes the hour drive back out to Kenwood, where Tom Mashler from Jonathan Cate Publishers is waiting for him because John is writing first in his own right in 64 and in 65 Spaniard in the Works. And he's got to meet the publishing deadline and he does the illustrations for the books. Mashler stays with him until after midnight. And then John winds down and goes to bed around 1 and gets up at 5. And this goes on 4 months.
Man, that's the one thing that I forget about. A lot of people forget about. He also had a writing career in the midst of all of this stuff. 1964, he released that first book called In His Own Right. And then he had another one, a couple years later?
The very next year in 65, Spaniard in the Works.
Man.
And the thing about Spaniard in the Works is in his own right, he calls upon everything he's written in high school and college, and he uses stuff he's already written. Well, he used it all. And in 65, he's got to write another book in 1 year and write all original stuff. So he remembers that he left a bunch of poems when he and Rod Murray and Stu Sutcliffe roomed together in college at Gambier Terrace in Liverpool. And he says to Bill Harry, get my stuff from Rod. Ask Rod Murray to give you those poems that he's got. Rod said, I'll give it to him when he gives me his part of the rent. He took off from Hamburg and he never paid me for the rent, and he can well afford it. You tell him to give me the rent, I'll give him the poems. So then Bill Harry goes to Brian and says, Brian, could you please, for the love of Pete, pay Rod Murray the back rent that John owes him, and I can get those poems for him. And Brian won't do it. Why? Because he doesn't approve of John doing the writing. He thinks John should mind his business, be a Beatle, focus on being a Beatle, and quit doing this extraneous writing. So he won't give Rod. So John, in 1 year, has to write enough to fill the second book, A Spaniard in the Works. His life, and not to mention, I don't know if you've ever renovated a home, but when he bought Kenwood, it was a 27-room home, and they're making it into a 16-room home. They've knocked down walls everywhere, and they're putting in a modern kitchen. It's dirty. It's filthy. The workmen arrive at 7 a.m. and start hammering and sawing. Cynthia and John and Julian are living in the third floor servants' quarters. They are there renovating the house from August of 1964 until May of 1965. Living through a renovation is Dante's seventh level of hell. And he's living through that as well as doing all this other stuff. How did he keep his sanity?
I was going to say, how did he not have a mental breakdown? How was he as a writer? He got into writing through Mimi. His Aunt Mimi helped introduce him to literature.
She did. She was a reading fanatic, and so was John. John read every day of his life 2 to 3 newspapers. You see him with his nose in a book all the time. When he's on the plane for the tour, he's reading. He read at least 2 books a week. He was hooked on reading, and he loved to write. In fact, when he's interviewed in 1965 by Kenneth Alsop, Alsop says, if you could only choose one, singing or writing, which would you choose? And John says, no contest, writing. I've been writing all of my life, long before the Beatles thing. And that's my passion. I love writing. So his writing, I will just say, the first book won the Foyles Literary Award for the finest book in the English language in 1964.
Wow. So he definitely had a career if he wanted to continue with that.
Yeah, he doesn't try it again after 65 because it almost killed him. Really, he could not find the time to do what he needed to do. And he wasn't going to break his commitment, but he just didn't have time.
Do you think he'd ever go back to it? Would he have gone back to it in later years?
I think so. I do think that John, because he loved it, he never stopped writing. I got to talk with the stewardess who was on the Electra 2 in 1964 when the Beatles were touring America, Betty Birdsell. And she said that John kept scraps of paper in his right-hand pocket. And anytime he heard anyone say anything that was a good phrase, he would immediately take out the paper, jot it down, and put it into his left-hand pocket. And she said she would say to him, would you stop working? You just did concerts. Can't you just relax? And he said, this is relaxing. You know, that's what he liked to do. He loved to write.
His writing was humorous at times, but it could get pretty dark. And no one, at least the media, wanted to even consider that John could be struggling at all with self-esteem issues or could be anything but happy all the time since he and the Beatles were so successful. But as some of his writing reflected, he showed moments of dark reflection. You include a few of his stories. Being buried alive with his uncle by an unfeeling mob. Pretty revealing.
Yeah, You remember I said that dream that he had was that he fell into a hole and couldn't get out. And he goes out, his uncle disappears, which is, I'm sure, how he felt when his uncle died and he was in Scotland and didn't get to be there for the funeral. And he goes out looking for his uncle. And the uncle says, I told you not to come. This is dangerous. And this mob surrounds them and puts them into a hole and then begins to fill the hole with dirt until only their heads are showing. And they're going to die in this hole. I mean, this is John telling you who he is. You know, when my uncle died, a part of me died right along with him. He's telling you, but nobody ever listens to him. He, in 1965, I think it was April the 12th or 13th, goes into EMI Studios before the others are there, and he sits down with George Martin and says, I want to play this song for you. I know you need a song to kick off the film, but I want you to listen to this song. And he plays this very tender, poignant ballad about how he used to be happy, but he's never happy anymore. Help me if you can. I'm feeling down. And I do appreciate your being around. Help me get my feet back on the ground. Won't you please help me? And George Martin says, John, it's beautiful, but it can't stay that way. Think about Shirley Bassey writing for the spy movies that she's written, you know, the James Bond 007 films. You start with a song like Thunderball or Goldfinger. That's what we need. We're going to have to change that song. We're going to use it. That's going to be the headliner song. But you're going to have to speed it up and pep it up. And let me give you an idea. If you will have Paul and George answering you right on your heels so that you can barely get the words out of your mouth and then they sing right on top of you, people will get the feeling of how harried and pushed and pressed you are. So you can still get out the feeling of the help that you need and how exhausted you are and how tired you are. Let's try for that. And John says, all right. And he gives up his dream of writing this beautiful ballad, and he turns help into the opener for the film. But 7 weeks later, Paul McCartney walks into the studio with a poignant, tender ballad that he's written yesterday, and he's allowed to record it exactly the way he wants it to be recorded. And it becomes exactly what Help would have become had John been allowed. And they write these two masterpieces within 7 weeks of each other. It's so uncanny. But John's song is never heard. His lyrics crying out for help are never heard because it's peppy and zippy and bursting with love. You know, it's happy, and no one hears the cry for help underneath. Tina Turner did a cover of it years later at a tribute for John, and she sings it the way that he wanted it sung. And it is, if you listen to Tina Turner sing it, that's what John wanted. It was a beautiful, it would have been John's Yesterday. It would have been his most famous song. I venture to say it would have been more popular than Imagine, but he just wasn't allowed to do it. And no one, when he sang I'm a Loser, no one heard him. He sang Nowhere Man, no one heard him. We didn't want to believe that John was unhappy, but he was miserably unhappy. You can hear, if you listen to even the peppy version, you can hear the sadness that's in his voice. But, you know, even let's fast forward to Your Blues, when John sang Your Blues years later. Everybody said, oh, that's just John doing a parody of a blues song. It's nothing to it. He doesn't mean that. And he comes out and says, I was so depressed, I thought about committing suicide. Nobody ever wants to believe that he is as sad as he is. How many times did he have to tell us? He told us over and over and over.
Nobody wanted to hear it. What about the guys in the band? What about Paul, George, and Ringo? Did he ever confide in them? Did he try to talk to them?
They knew about Julia. I mean, Paul was there, George was there. They were in the Quarrymen at the point, and they adored Julia. They used to go to her house in 1 Blockville Road and get into the shower. And that acoustics were great there. And she would put on a big funny hat, and she would get 2 pot lids and bang them together to make the drum. She was really one of their first drummers. And they adored her, and they knew what John went through when she died. But they didn't talk about it. There is a famous quote that says, the same hot water that hard boils the egg softens the carrot. And Paul loses his mother too, but it softens Paul, and it makes him a more tender person. and it hard boils John. The effects were completely different. And the two of them rarely ever discussed it, but I think they knew what both of them were feeling. And George definitely knew. George was John's little brother. He followed John everywhere he went during John's Liverpool College of Art days. In fact, when he goes to see Cynthia, she has appendicitis and she hasn't seen him in several days and she can't wait for him to come to the hospital. She dolls herself all up and she's waiting to see him. And George walks in with him and she breaks into tears and George is horrified. He doesn't know why she's crying, but she didn't want George to come. George was his shadow. And they were very, very close. In fact, that's why John got so mad at George when he wrote his own biography years later. He didn't even mention John. And John is like, I did everything for him. Yeah, I took him everywhere I went. I taught him this, I taught him that. He doesn't even mention me. And he had his feelings really, really hurt.
Were John and Paul supportive of George writing songs? We know in the early days he didn't write as much, but then, of course, in the later Beatles years, he did. Were they supportive of that?
At first, they really didn't at the beginning.
No.
Bill Harry was the one that was encouraging George to write. He always told him he could write. But they were in Bournemouth, I believe. They were in the south of England in, it would be August of 1963. And they were performing a gig down there. And Paul knocks on John's door. Cynthia's with him for the first time ever because the press has outed her as John's wife. And so now she's traveling with him. And he knocks on John's door and says to them, "You're not going to believe what's happening downstairs." And John said, "What do you mean? What's going on?" And Paul says, "George is down there writing a song." And John's quote is, "Who told him that he could?" They are really against it. And I think they're a little bit jealous. But then, as time goes along, yes.
As we get to the late 60s, they were really impressed with what George could come up with.
Still a little bit jealous, And George, I don't know, have you seen Help? Have you seen the movie Help?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it.
Yeah. There's a scene, they're in the inspector's office and the phone rings and the inspector picks it up and he, says to Paul, "It's for you." And Paul says, "What? Only John and me know we're here." And George says, "I know we're here." And that is kind of the way it was. John and me do everything. It's John, it's me, we're the big dogs. And George very quietly, "I'm a big dog too." He always had to really push to get noticed.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Let's talk a little bit more about that movie Help, originally titled 8 Arms to Hold You. Now, with A Hard Day's Night, the 4 members had some input, and they seemed to really be into filming that movie, but with Help, that was not the case. They saw it as drudge work. The director, Richard Lester, you write, was far too preoccupied with his own challenges to connect the dots for the boys.
Yeah, and they film all the movies are filmed out of sequence. I mean, it doesn't go in sequence. So the very first thing that they film are the scenes in the Bahamas when they have gone to the temple and they escape and come up through a pool and Clang, the bad guy, is after them and they're running on the beach. He's after them with a machete, and that's the end of the movie. Then they go to Austria and they film the middle of the movie. And then they go back to Twickenham Studios in London and film the beginning of the movie. And they can't put any of this together. And they tell them it's a spy spoof. And they tell them it's a zany comedy. And they tell them a guy in a religious sect is after you trying to kill Ringo for the ring that he has on because it's a sacrificial ring. But that's all they know. And none of this makes any sense to them. Why are we skiing down a mountain? And why are we going to a jeweler? And what is going on? And they never tell them. But the main reason that they don't connect in 1965 is that they have met Bob Dylan, they have tried marijuana, and they have found it to be immensely fun. And they are smoking marijuana. As Richard Lester said, they smoked it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Brandon DeWilde, who was a youth actor, an American youth actor who starred in the movie Shane, was a gigantic Beatles fan. And when they got ready to fly to the Bahamas to begin the filming of Help, he sent them a big bag of very high grade, expensive marijuana. And so Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, who were their roadies and their best friends and did everything for them, took a carton of regular cigarettes, carefully unwrapped it, took each cigarette, slit it, put all of the regular contents out, filled it with marijuana, resealed each cigarette, put it back into the carton, resealed the ends of the carton, and that's how they got it through customs. And so you could film them in the morning. If you got to them in the morning, they would do a pretty good job of filming. But after lunch, they laughed the whole time. And they would have to film it over and over and over and over. They couldn't remember their lines. And Richard Lester was extremely patient with them. And he never got mad. He knew what was going on. He was real patient. But they got as much footage as they could in the morning, because after lunch, they weren't very cooperative.
Well, so let me ask you, has it aged well? What do you think of it when you watch it today? Is it still pretty silly?
Well, I adore it. It's my favorite Beatles.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so quotable. There's so many lines from the film that are so quotable. And it's my favorite. And most people prefer Hard Day's Night. They think it's edgier and artsier. I love Help. I think both of them, they're good. Hard Day's Night symbolically lets you feel what the Beatles were experiencing with fame. They're shut in a train car, and they're shut on a train, and they're shut in a hotel room. And that's how the Beatles were. They were trapped by fame. They were in a car, in a room, in a room, in a car. But Help is about them being chased. I mean, Ringo is sent a ring that he puts on his finger that is a sacrificial ring, and it's a James Bond spoof. They play the James Bond theme. They go to rural locations just like James Bond, and they put the name of the location underneath it in James Bond print. But it is really about the way that they were being chased and haunted and trapped by the fans. And the fans adore them, but the fans were very dangerous, and many times they were knocked down and almost killed. At one point in Dallas, girls got a hold of Ringo and they had him on the ground. Art Schreiber, who was touring with the Beatles, was there. He was the correspondent for the Westinghouse Network. He said, I was doing everything I could to get those girls off of him, and I'm watching Ringo's face turn purple. Finally, the police got them off. Same thing in Adelaide. They were knocked down in Adelaide. Many times their lives were seriously in danger. And that's what Help portrays.
Who decided to change it from 8 Arms to Hold You to Help?
Well, John and Paul had a fit because mainly, I mean, Paul was always nice. Paul was always politically correct. Anytime they needed to get out of a situation, they would call upon Paul to talk to the people and get them out of it. But John, thank goodness, spoke up and said, I can't write a song about 8 arms to hold you. We don't do songs about orgies. I don't know what you want from me. I can't write a song about 8 arms to hold you. That's creepy. Come up with something else. And they had other suggestions. The Day the Clowns Died, which is just plain scary. Beatles 2, how imaginative. And finally, someone came up with Help. And it was great. It was the perfect title for the movie. But, they just said, I can't write a song about that. You expect me to write a theme song? I can't write a song like that.
8 Arms to Hold You, yeah.
Yeah.
John and Paul, arguably the greatest songwriting duo in music history. What was their relationship like from the beginning?
Well, from the day that John meets Paul, in that book we were talking about earlier, John knows that if he lets Paul into his band, he's going to be a coup waiting to happen. He's smart. He's good looking. He can do something that John can't do, which is tune his own guitar. He can do something else John can't do, which is remember lyrics. When Paul comes to the Wilton Garden Fete and goes across the street, and he knows he's been asked to audition for the Beatles, but he coolly doesn't act that way. He just says, do you want me to play 20 Flight Rock for you? And puts his foot up on a chair and begins to play. 20 Flight Rock has 3,000 verses. And if you can know the words to 20 Flight Rock, you can memorize anything. And John is really impressed, but he knows if he lets that kind of a person into his group, he's always going to want to take over. Thinks about it 3 days before he sends Pete Shotton to invite Paul to join the band. He finally, and John always does this, he always opts for the good of the many instead of the good of the few. He always opts for the band instead of his own personal happiness. And he invites Paul to join, but he knows he's got to keep an eye on it because he is going to try to take over. You've got two alpha males, two big dogs, and I mean, it's a struggle. You know, we already talked about the fact that it's Paul that wants Pete out of the band, Paul and George. And initially, when there's just Paul and John and some of the members of the Quarrymen, Paul starts lobbying for George Harrison to join the band. And John auditions him and he's impressed with his playing. He listens to him on the top of the double-decker bus. Some people say he played guitar boogie. Some people say he played raunchy. He's impressed with him. But George is 3 years younger. He's 14. He's a child. And John doesn't really want a 14-year-old in the group. And so he puts off having George join the band. And one night he shows up at the morgue skiffle cellar and George is there, ready to perform. And John says, "What's he doing here?" Paul said, "I told him he could come." "You did what?" "I told him he could join the group." Well, I mean, this is early on. This is March of 1958.
Without coming to John.
Yeah. And already McCartney is asserting his leadership. And for the rest of the time, it is that way until John really gets into drugs. And by the time that you get to 66, 67, he just gives up. He just relinquishes leadership and Paul steps in. Magical Mystery Tour, all Paul. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul's idea. Paul sings 80% of the songs. Paul is ruling the roost. Then we get to the White Album and John begins to clean up his act. He's now leaving Cynthia. He's with Yoko. Yoko is telling him he's got to straighten up and fly right. And the White Album is predominantly John. In fact, there's so many John songs that he could have had a solo album from it. He could have filled a solo album from what he does on White Album. But for a while, Paul really leads the Beatles. So I'm listening to a DJ on the afternoon that the Twin Towers were hit. And he's talking about what happened when those planes hit the Twin Towers. And he's interviewing the engineer that designed the buildings. And he says to them, "What made them collapse?" And the engineer says, "You're asking me the wrong question. You should be asking me, how did they stand so long?" Because they stood for minutes after they were hit. How did they stand so long before they collapsed? That's what you should ask me. And that is the question with John and Paul. How did these two geniuses get along, powerful men, get along with each other as long as they did? How did the Beatles stand so long? Because they're together a decade. You know, it's impressive that they can work together so well. And it wasn't really so much tension. I mean, there were times when they laughed and joked and they have fun together. They don't dislike each other, but they're competitive and they know who the other one is. And they know that the other one wants to be the leader. It's not that they don't like each other. They respect each other and they're highly competitive, highly competitive. John was the one that sang Love Me Do, not Paul. And when George Martin says, "John, you can't sing it because you're playing the mouth organ," and people will laugh and call the song Love Me Wah, because you go love, love me, wah, and the others say the word do. They're going to call it Love Me Wah. So Paul is going to have to sing it. Paul didn't want to sing it because it's too high in the range for Paul. John can sing higher, but he's tasked with singing Love Me Do, and it does pretty well. It goes to like number 17 or 27 or something. And John says, "Fine then." And he immediately sits down to write Please Please Me and wants it to go to number one, which it does because he wants to best Paul. It's a very healthy, competitive relationship.
What was the first song they wrote together?
Well, I mean, they way back before Love Me Do and way back before Please Please Me, they're writing the one after 909. Some of their earlier collaborations happened years before that. But by the time that you get to I Want to Hold Your Hand and the song that was called 17, you know, they really worked together on bits and pieces. John would write a bridge, Paul would write a chorus, John would write a verse, Paul would alter a word or two. They worked together on a lot of their songs. I mean, even songs that are known predominantly by one. Let's take Hey Jude, which is clearly Paul's song. The movement you need is on your shoulders. Paul was going to take that out. And John said, "You're definitely not going to take that out. That's the best line in the whole song. You're leaving it." And at one point, I saw her standing there, John says, "I'm going to get rid of that line. She was just 17. You know what I mean. I'm taking that out." And Paul says, "Oh, no, 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 no. We're leaving that in because it's an eyebrow raiser. You know what I mean. She was just 17. They worked together even from the early days. But some of the songs they wrote entirely on their own without the other one adding or changing anything. So, you just have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
To have been a fly on the wall during those songwriting sessions. Ooh,
yeah.
Fascinating stuff. You did talk about the song Yesterday, and I want to go back to that a little bit because there was that moment that you write of that John felt minimized by Paul's song Yesterday. In the notes section of this chapter, you quote some people who supported that theory. They all pretty much across the board said it created tension between the two. There is another song where you talked about Help, the song that John wrote, and he wanted it to be something different than it ended up being. It's Only Love. That's a song that John recorded, I think, a day after Yesterday was recorded. John hated it. Why did he hate it so much?
Any song that John tells you that he hates or he says it's garbage, you can have an alert. A bell needs to go off in your head when he says that, because that means it's a personal song and it embarrasses him. And he doesn't want people to listen to it. If he says it's garbage, it's no good, I hate it, that means I'm embarrassed by it. So It's Only Love is a very true story about what was happening to John and Cynthia at this point. They're fighting. Is it right that you and I should fight every night? Just the sight of you makes nighttime bright, very bright. And there's another verse that John writes that's not included in the song about how much he loves her, but they're having a hard time getting along. It is autobiographical. It is very much about his marriage. He didn't want to discuss that. He didn't want people knowing anything about his marriage or what's going on with him privately as far as his love for Cynthia goes. And he has to record it the very next day after Paul has recorded what is going to be the most famous song that the Beatles ever write. And he's jealous. I mean, who wouldn't be jealous? He wasn't allowed to do Help the way he wanted it to. And when Paul comes in after lunch, and yes, all of the Beatles are there, and he plays for them this song and sings it to his guitar, Ringo says, "Well, I can't put any drums to that." And George says, "Well, you don't need another guitar." And John says, "Just do it solo." They all agree that Paul should do it solo, but they're still jealous. And when they play Blackpool weeks later, right before they go to America, they go up and play Blackpool. George announces Paul by saying something like, "And here's Paul McCartney doing what he does best." It's very sarcastic. And John makes a real snarky comment about it when they're in America. Something like, "And here's Paul, the star of his own show," or something like that. They're jealous, but it's only natural. This is the first time that they haven't been the Beatles. This is the first time that one of them sings without the others playing a note or adding backing or doing anything. And in this highly competitive relationship that John and Paul had, it can't help but be a check mark. I won this one. So
what do you think of It's Only Love? Do you like it?
Yes, It's Only Love, Cynthia said, was her favorite song that the Beatles ever recorded. And the melody is gorgeous. And tons of people have covered It's Only Love because it's a beautiful song. There's nothing wrong with the melody. There's nothing wrong with the lyrics. John may not like it because it outs him as a loving husband, but it's a gorgeous creation.
Yeah. Has nothing to do with how it sounds. It's more of a personal thing. I want to ask you about Brian Epstein. He was so influential, so important to the band. And you write that, yes, he pushed the boys hard, but no harder than he would push himself. How would you describe Brian's personality, and how did he get on with the band members, particularly with John?
Well, he and John were extremely close. In fact, I think that they took another trip together when John took Cynthia to Paris for her honeymoon. Months after they were married, 6 months later, they go to Paris for a honeymoon. And she calls it my very brief honeymoon and only records 4 days of the honeymoon. But on the 4th day, Brian arrives in Paris. And I would love to get some documentation because Cynthia flies home by herself. John does not fly home with her. I am 99% positive that John stayed and he and Brian did things around Paris and spent some time together. They were very, very close. But John would never say anything about it because of the way he was teased when he went on holiday with him earlier to Barcelona, to the Gold Coast of Spain. So he wouldn't tell anyone. He kept it really hush hush. They got along great. Paul and Brian says in many accounts that he had trouble getting along with Paul because Paul spoke up and said what he wanted Brian to do, and they butted heads. For example, in the summer of 1965, Brian thought they were getting overexposed. Everywhere he went, there were posters of the Beatles, and the Beatles were being played on too many radio stations, and they had the film coming out, and people started to dislike them. The press specifically started to dislike them and were out to get them. And the question they would ask the Beatles in 1964 was, how long do you think you'll last? But in 1965, it would be, aren't the Stones more popular than you are? How about this new band? Aren't they more popular than you are? And they constantly wanted them to fail. So Brian said, we are going to cancel the 1965 UK tour. We're not going to go on that tour in late October and November. I'm canceling it. And in fact, he did cancel it because you're getting overexposed. We need to pull you back from the public and make them hungry for you. Well, George and John and Ringo are fine with that decision, and Paul is furious and confronts Brian and says, that's a stupid move. We need to go back out. We need to stay in the public eye. If you want to change something, change the kind of songs we're playing. We're playing poppy songs. We don't need to be pop anymore. We need to move into a new realm of music. Eventually, Brian agrees with him, and he puts the UK tour back on, and they begin to change the kind of songs because the next album that comes out is Rubber Soul, which is completely different from what they've done before. He listens to Paul, but he didn't like Paul telling him what to do, and it annoyed him. He gets along fine with Ringo and fine with George. They don't ever really rock the boat. But Brian was a wise man. The Beatles pre-Brian threw sandwiches at the audience, wore leathers, smoked on stage. They were rough and tumble Liverpool northern men. If they didn't want to sing the rest of a song, they just stopped and went into another song. And if you've ever been to Liverpool, when you're in an audience in Liverpool and a band is playing, they're screaming at the band, "You're no good! Shut up!" And the band screams back at them. You can imagine what they say back to them. And it's a very raucous atmosphere, and that's the Beatles. But Brian says, oh no, you're going to wear suits. You're going to cut your hair just so. It's going to be coiffed. You're going to bow from the waist at the end of every song. You're going to be polite. You're going to be gentlemen. And that makes them palatable to the mothers and fathers of America. And that is what gets them accepted on the Ed Sullivan Show. But the thing that we forget, and the person we forget about, who has slipped into history almost unnoticed, is Alan Williams, their first manager, who taught them that you don't stand there like wooden Indians. When you perform, you mock show. You put on a show. And if it wouldn't have been for the influence of Alan Williams, who made them showmen, you couldn't have had them tone it down to become the Beatles. So both managers really contributed a great deal.
Yeah, and I remember, John, when Brian passed, and he was so young, 32, drug overdose, died in, 67. John was the one that said that once he died, that was pretty much the beginning of the end.
It was.
Of the Beatles.
It was. And that's the point where John really relinquishes control of the band, and Paul steps in, and he's really the manager. And Paul did a great job. I mean, Sgt. Pepper's is heralded as the greatest LP that the Beatles did. Paul, I'm not dissing Paul at all. He did a fabulous job when he's in charge. It just depends on what personality you prefer and what song sounds you prefer. And obviously, I'm a John Lennon person, and obviously.
Yes, and it shows. You do an amazing job of these books, but you don't do it all alone. I'll let you do the honors and mention all the people that help with this book and all the books in this series.
There's so many people that make these books happen. I mean, the first book, Shoulda Been There, was entirely in the hands of the people in Liverpool. All of them took their chapters because it's all set in Liverpool, and they all edited everything. June Furlong, who was the life model at Liverpool College of Art. Well, she was a character. She just passed away this last year. And she was so bubbly, and she was just a beautiful and very successful model. Francis Bacon, Julian Foy, all of the big artists painted her. And John followed her around like a puppy dog, trying to find out how she became famous. What did you do? What made you famous? And she would, tell him what he needed to do. And he came to her when Brian offered management. He came to her and said, should we let Brian manage us? At that time, there was no gay. Everybody, he would say he's a queer. And she says, oh, John, let me ask you a question. And he's like, what? And then she goes, do you have a hit record? He said, well, no. Well, have you ever been on TV? Well, no. Well, have you ever been in a movie? And he's like, well, no. And she goes, well, then what have you got to lose? And that he said because of that, he accepted Brian, and Brian went on to make him have a hit record and on TV and have his own movie. But there were so many people in Liverpool that helped. I mean, there was, of course, Bob Wooler, the DJ at the Cavern Club, and Patty Delaney, who was the doorman, and Helen Anderson, who was John's best friend at Liverpool College of Art. And I just got to interview her. She is just an amazing person. I wrote an article about her for Culture Sonar. She was the one that designed John's leather cap that he wore. She's a famous designer. She went on to design the costumes for the TV show Dallas. Just a tremendously artistic and wonderful lady. Got to talk to Len Gary about the Quarrymen and Rod Murray about John, and all of them changed their chapters. I mean, they were so nice. And Astrid gave me the picture for the cover of that book. Yeah, it was a community effort. Then we get to the later years with Shivering Inside. Richard Langham, who was second engineer at EMI, took all of the chapters about them. I have a chapter in which they go minute by minute through the recording of their first album, Please Please Me. And John C. Wynne, famous writer who did Way Beyond Compare, got the tape of what happened that day, and he transcribed it. And because of him, I was able to drop in every word of dialogue that they said that day, and the actual words that they spoke and what they said and how they recorded it. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the other authors like Bruce Spicer and, of course, Beatles guru Mark Lewis. And we talked about Jim Birkenstadt and Hunter Davies, all of these people who paved the way for me to be able to tell this story. And I compare and contrast what they said. I make graphs of what people said happened and try to find the thread of truth, where there's exaggeration and where there's truth, and try to get to the kernel of what really happened on any given day. Then there are the artists. My husband did the covers for the last 3 books. Beautiful artwork. He has had artwork all over Louisiana, had his own one-man show at the Norton Art Gallery, and really a great artist. And he also did all of the hands-on work for the book, the formatting and the ISBN and the Library of Congress, and does all of that. Editors. Without editors, I would really be a blooming idiot without my editors. And I had Al Sussman for this new book that's coming out, who is the executive editor for Beatle Fan Magazine, and Lena Stagg, one of the finest editors I've ever worked with, who is the author of the Recipe Record series, and Janet Davis, who is the executive editor for Octopus's Garden fanzine. And I want to tell you, Eric, I had thicker than my book edits from Janet Davis. She worked herself, and so did Lena, and so did Al, to the bone to make this book right. We looked up so many facts and details and changed and tweaked, and it just is very difficult to do a book that you read like a narrative, but it is actually factually spot on. You can't make anything up. You can't stretch the truth. You can't get something wrong. So every sentence is footnoted in document. There are 4,000 footnotes in the book because I have to make sure that everything is just as it happened. It takes a lot of people. I have a research assistant named Susie Duchateau, and she does a lot of the transcribing of interviews and helping me get the words right. It's exhausting, really, to do.
Yeah, there's no way you would have been able to do this on your own. And you and Lena have a great podcast, too. You got to promote the podcast. She said. She said.
Yeah, we just finished a year of doing interviews with the Beatles family. We started with Rogue Best. We talked with Julia Baird. We talked with Helen Anderson. We talked with the first real bass player for the Beatles, because Stu never really wanted to do it, Chas Newby, who after a few weeks, he was there the night that Beatlemania broke out for the first time, and the girls screamed and swarmed the stage.
I want to listen to that one. That's another guy we didn't mention. That was
Chas Newby. But he wanted to be an engineer, and he wanted to go on and get his doctorate. And I said, Chas, would you change things? And he said, oh no, I never wanted what they had. I wanted to teach, and my life was so happy.
That's great.
Yeah, he and Pete get together and perform at the new Casbah that they're renovating all the time. And there's so many people who had great stories. And we really had a great year recording those.
And people can find it. I mean, you could simply Google it, but is there, I know you have a website. It's probably best to go to your website.
You can go to the website, and there's a link to She Said on the website. It's also on iTunes and Spotify and YouTube and Podbean, and just like I'm sure everywhere that your podcast is, all of the same places.
JohnLennonSeries.com.
JohnLennonSeries.com. The book will be out on John's birthday in just a few days on the 9th of October.
Yep. This episode will be up on the day of John's birthday. We're recording it early in the week. But yeah, so when people are hearing this, get it now. Go to JohnLennonSeries.com.
Shades of Life Part 1. I'm already hard at work on Shades of Life Part 2. I'm writing the Shea Stadium concert. And oh my gosh, it's going to take a month to write that, because there's so many films and photos and interviews and people who were there. And I'm trying to talk to everyone. And it's exciting.
And of course, how could I not go without asking you, what is your favorite Beatles song?
Well, I have so many. The one that really touches my heart is that cover song that we talked about, where John sings about how he feels about his mother, Baby, It's You. Nothing speaks to John's deep, deep love of her like that song. And we've got to remember that the Beatles for years were a stage band. They were a band that performed other people's songs and took other people's songs and made it their own. I mean, you listen to the Isley Brothers doing Twist and Shout, and then you listen to the Beatles, and there's no comparison. The Beatles are the ones who make Twist and Shout. It's their song. But if you want to talk about a Lennon composition, I love There's a Place. It, again, sings about the fact that he's so lonely and so sad, and he misses her so much. But there's always a place that he can go, and it's my mind. And There's No Time When I'm Alone, I Think of You. It's another song for Julia. I'll Cry Instead. Great autobiographical song. My favorite John Lennon song is his solo song is I'm Losing You. Oh, I mean, it is the gutsiest, coolest, bluesy song. That sound of the song is so raw and guttural. I love I'm Losing You. But I mean, from day to day, I switch favorites for sure.
I don't blame you. I figured I'd put you on the spot. Those are good picks, though. Those aren't the standard, those aren't like the major hits. Those are songs that, for those who are familiar with the hits, dig a little deeper and listen to some of those songs. Yeah, John Lennon he's gone but never forgotten. He never will be. So happy birthday, John, wherever you are. He's 80, he'd be 81 today, right? Is that what we said? Okay.
That's right. And he said that you never die until the last person who remembers you says your name for the last time. So everybody out there, keep saying, John Winston Lennon, we hardly knew you.
Jude Southerland Kessler, thank you for being here.
Thank you. This was just wonderful, so wonderful. I enjoyed it so much.
Thanks to Jude Southerland Kessler for taking us through the John Lennon series of books, including her latest, Shades of Life, Part 1. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy of the latest book, Shades of Life, Part 1, and support not just Jude, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on our show notes page. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening. And join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.